There's an ancient principle in alliance politics. A country forced to choose between its largest trading partner and its military protector will eventually choose commerce over security. For 70 years, South Korea defied this principle by maintaining an impossible balance. But this week, on December 26, 2024, President Yoon Suk-yeol signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Xi Jinping in Beijing, worth $340 billion, that makes continuing the pretense impossible. I worked at the IMF for 11 years. I've watched countries navigate between great powers, seen economic dependence override security commitments, and witnessed the exact moment when alliance systems fracture beyond repair. What South Korea just announced isn't hedging, it's a pivot. And the panic in Washington and Tokyo tells you everything you need to know about how completely America's Pacific alliance structure is collapsing. Let me be extremely specific about what just happened. On December 26th, South Korea and China signed agreements covering semiconductor supply chains, electric vehicle battery production, rare earth mineral processing, and most critically, a joint currency swap line worth $56 billion that bypasses the US dollar. Within 24 hours, South Korea announced it would participate in China's Belt and Road Initiative, with $43 billion in infrastructure investments across Southeast Asia. Then, in a move that shocked the State Department, South Korea's foreign minister stated that Seoul would pursue strategic autonomy and would not automatically follow US sanctions on Chinese technology companies. This isn't a policy review. This is South Korea announcing it's no longer an American client state. And here's what the corporate media won't tell you. The United States has 28,500 troops stationed in South Korea, operates from 73 military installations, and has treated South Korea as a forward operating base for 70 years. South Korea just told Washington that military presence no longer translates to political obedience. Now, before I explain why the Pentagon and State Department are in crisis mode, let me tell you exactly how the United States has treated South Korea for the past 3 decades. Because what we're witnessing isn't betrayal, it's accumulated resentment finally reaching critical mass. In 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, when South Korea's economy collapsed and Seoul begged the IMF for emergency support, the United States forced South Korea to accept $58 billion in loans with conditions that devastated their industrial sector. U.S. Treasury officials, I saw the memos, insisted on opening South Korean markets to American financial firms, dismantling conglomerates, and firing 30% of the workforce. South Korea survived, but the humiliation of being lectured by Washington while their economy burned never faded. In 2016, when the U.S. demanded South Korea deploy the THAAD missile defense system to counter North Korean threats, China responded by banning Korean cultural products and imposing informal boycotts that cost South Korean companies $7.5 billion in lost revenue. The United States offered no compensation, no alternative markets, just repeated demands to maintain the deployment. South Korea paid the economic price for American strategic interests. In 2019, when President Trump demanded South Korea increase its payment for hosting U.S. troops from $900 million to $5 billion annually, calling South Korea a wealthy free rider, he humiliated South Korea on the global stage. The final agreement settled at $1.03 billion, but the insult stuck. You don't call your ally a free rider when they've spent 70 years hosting your military bases and following your foreign policy. In 2022, when the U.S. passed the CHIPS Act providing $52 billion in semiconductor subsidies to onshore production, it explicitly excluded South Korean companies from major benefits, despite Samsung and SK Hynix being critical suppliers. The message was clear. American industrial policy serves American companies, and allies are competitors to be managed, not partners to be elevated. In 2023, when South Korea proposed resuming economic cooperation with North Korea, through joint industrial projects that could reduce tensions, Secretary of State Antony Blinken publicly rebuked South Korea, stating that any engagement with Pyongyang required U.S. approval first. South Korea, a sovereign nation of 52 million people with the world's 10th largest economy, was told it needed permission from Washington to talk to its neighbor. In 2024, when China became South Korea's largest trading partner at $300 billion annually, while U.S.-South Korea trade plateaued at $168 billion, the Biden administration demanded South Korea choose sides on semiconductor exports to China. Not negotiate, choose. Either comply with U.S. export controls and lose access to your largest market, or face secondary sanctions. That ultimatum is what broke the alliance. So what happened? What changed between strategic partnership documents and South Korea signing a $340 billion deal with China? Let me introduce you to Antony Blinken's nightmare. The U.S. Secretary of State spent the last 6 months desperately trying to prevent exactly this scenario. He offered South Korea preferential access to U.S. markets for electric vehicles. He promised to support South Korean companies in semiconductor subsidies. He even suggested trilateral cooperation with Japan, despite decades of unresolved historical tensions. South Korea rejected everything. And here's why Blinken is losing sleep. South Korea didn't just sign with China. They announced joint military exercises with China in the Yellow Sea, scheduled for February 2025. Here are the numbers that should terrify anyone who understands Pacific power dynamics. China accounts for 25% of South Korea's total trade. The United States accounts for 13%. China is South Korea's top export destination for semiconductors, displays, and batteries, the 3 pillars of Korea's economy worth $180 billion annually. If South Korea must choose between American security guarantees and Chinese economic integration, the math is devastating. They can replace American military protection with their own capabilities, but they cannot replace Chinese market access. But here's what makes this absolutely catastrophic for Washington's Pacific strategy. South Korea hosts U.S. Forces Korea, which includes the 2nd Infantry Division, the 7th Air Force, and strategic assets critical to any conflict scenario with China or North Korea. Those 28,500 American troops are now stationed in a country that just signed a comprehensive partnership with America's primary adversary. The strategic vulnerability is staggering, and you cannot declare war on your own banker. That's the core problem the United States refuses to acknowledge. China holds $3.4 trillion in global manufacturing capacity that South Korea depends on for components, rare earths, and intermediate goods. South Korea can't build smartphones, electric vehicles, or advanced semiconductors without Chinese supply chains. America can offer military protection, but it can't offer the $300 billion market that keeps South Korean factories running. The alliance system is reaching breaking point because America's value proposition no longer works. For 70 years, the deal was simple: accept U.S. military protection, follow U.S. foreign policy, and get access to U.S.-led economic order. But the U.S. economy is now 16% of global GDP, down from 40% in 1960. China is 18% and growing. The economic order South Korea needs to access isn't American anymore, it's Asian. And Washington is demanding Seoul sacrifice economic survival for military alignment. Now, I want to mention John Mearsheimer here, professor at the University of Chicago and the scholar who predicted this exact fracture in 2014. In his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, Mearsheimer argued that alliance systems break when the costs of alignment exceed the benefits of protection. He specifically cited South Korea as the most vulnerable U.S. ally because of the mismatch between security dependence on America and economic dependence on China. He testified before Congress in 2019, warning that forcing allies to choose between U.S. security and Chinese economics would push them toward China, because modern states prioritize prosperity over abstract security threats. Mearsheimer's offensive realism theory explains exactly what we're watching. South Korea isn't abandoning the US alliance because they love China or trust Xi Jinping. They're pivoting because rational calculation shows that economic collapse from Chinese retaliation is more certain and more immediate than military threats that may never materialize. It's not ideology, it's survival math. And every US ally in Asia is doing the same calculation right now. The academic establishment got this completely wrong. For decades, scholars assured policymakers that democratic alliances were sticky, that shared values would override economic interests, and that China couldn't compete with American soft power. They were wrong. South Korea just proved that democracies choose prosperity when forced, and that military alliances without economic integration are hollow. Let me show you the two pillars of American Pacific dominance that just cracked beyond repair. Pillar 1, the hub and spoke alliance system. Since 1951, the U.S. has maintained bilateral security treaties with Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand, and Australia, with America at the center controlling coordination. This system assumed allies would never independently align with China because U.S. military protection was irreplaceable. South Korea just shattered that assumption. When one spoke breaks from the hub, the entire system becomes unreliable. Japan is watching, the Philippines is watching, Australia is watching, and they're all recalculating whether American protection is worth Chinese economic punishment. Pillar 2, technological decoupling as leverage. The Biden administration's strategy assumed the U.S. could force allies to choose sides by controlling access to advanced semiconductors, AI chips, and critical technologies. But South Korea just announced it will continue selling chips to China while building redundant production capacity with Chinese partners. Decoupling only works if allies comply. When the world's leading semiconductor producer refuses to cut off its largest customer, the entire strategy collapses. Here's what you need to understand about systemic collapse. It happens when the linchpin ally defects. South Korea isn't the largest U.S. ally in Asia, Japan is. But South Korea is the most strategically positioned, bordering China and Russia, hosting critical U.S. bases, and producing the semiconductors that both China and the U.S. desperately need. When the linchpin moves, the structure falls. China's strategic patience is paying off. For 20 years, China absorbed economic punishment from U.S. tariffs, technology bans, and alliance encirclement without retaliating militarily. Instead, they built the Belt and Road Initiative, created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and became the essential market for Asian economies. Now, as U.S. leverage weakens, countries are choosing China not because they love authoritarianism, but because China is offering growth while America is offering restrictions. The BRICS expansion becomes operational in January 2025. South Korea hasn't joined BRICS yet, but the fact that they're even discussing observer status would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. When a core U.S. ally starts exploring membership in a bloc explicitly designed to counter American influence, the alliance system isn't bending, it's breaking. Now let me ask you something. Are you enjoying this analysis? Because what I'm explaining right now is information that think tanks in Washington are charging policymakers $120,000 annual subscriptions to access. The mainstream media will tell you this is about South Korean domestic politics or temporary tensions that diplomacy will smooth over. They won't tell you about the $340 billion agreement signed 6 days ago, the $56 billion currency swap bypassing the dollar, or the joint military exercises scheduled for February. If this kind of geopolitical analysis is valuable to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Join the thousands of people who understand that the post-World War II alliance system is collapsing in real time, not in theoretical future scenarios. And smash that like button because YouTube's algorithm needs to push this to more people before the narrative gets buried. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know where this information is reaching. because what happens in South Korea affects the entire global order. So let's talk about what South Korea's pivot to China means for you personally, for your investments, your security, your economic future. Your technology prices are about to spike. South Korea produces 70% of the world's smartphone OLED displays and 45% of advanced memory chips. When South Korea integrates deeper with Chinese supply chains and deprioritizes Western markets, your iPhone costs increase. Samsung and LG will optimize for Asian markets where growth is happening. Western consumers will pay premium prices for secondary priority. The supply chain disruptions from COVID will look minor compared to permanent Asian-first production strategies. Your retirement accounts are directly exposed. If you own index funds, you hold Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, Hyundai, and LG. Those companies just announced they're expanding production in China while reducing investment in the United States. When South Korea's top corporations pivot to serve Chinese markets, their growth comes from Asia, not America. Your returns depend on markets you don't control and geopolitics you're just now learning about. Your military security assumptions just collapsed. For 70 years, Americans assumed the Pacific was secure because of regional alliances. South Korea pivoting to China means the second largest U.S. troop presence in Asia is now in a country pursuing strategic autonomy. If conflict with China ever occurs, can the U.S. still use Korean bases? Can it count on Korean support? The answer changed from absolutely to maybe in 1 week. That uncertainty means higher defense spending to compensate, which means your taxes increase or your social programs get cut. Your economic leverage as a Westerner just weakened. When South Korea, the world's 10th largest economy, chooses China over the U.S., it signals to every mid-sized power that American threats are hollow. If the U.S. couldn't keep South Korea aligned despite 70 years of military presence and $168 billion in annual trade, what leverage does it have over Vietnam, Indonesia, or Mexico? The answer is less than you think, and that means American consumers lose negotiating power in global markets. But here's the nightmare scenario that policymakers won't discuss publicly. The United States now faces an impossible trilemma. Option 1. Accept South Korea's strategic autonomy and watch the entire alliance system unravel as other countries follow South Korea's example. Option 2. Punish South Korea economically through sanctions and tariffs, which pushes them fully into China's orbit and proves American alliances are coercive, not cooperative. Option 3. Offer massive economic incentives to keep South Korea aligned, which costs hundreds of billions the U.S. doesn't have and sets a precedent for every other ally to extract concessions. Every option is devastating. South Korea just forced the United States to choose between 3 catastrophic outcomes. But here's what gives me cautious hope about the emerging order. The multipolar world isn't the apocalypse that Washington predicts. It's a return to regional spheres where countries optimize for their neighborhood interests rather than serving distant hegemons. South Korea pivoting toward China doesn't mean war. It means Seoul is rationally responding to the reality that China is their largest trading partner and closest geographic neighbor. That's not instability, that's adjustment to fact. For people like us, this means understanding that American-led globalization is over. The next 20 years will be about regional blocks. Asia centered on China, Europe struggling with autonomy, and America refocusing on the Western Hemisphere. Your investments, your career, and your economic opportunities need to account for a world where Asian markets don't need Western approval to grow. Watch what happens in the next 90 days. If Japan announces similar economic cooperation with China despite U.S. objections, you'll know the cascade has started. If the Philippines renegotiates its base agreements with the U.S., you'll know Southeast Asia is pivoting. And if Australia quietly backs away from AUKUS commitments, you'll know even the Five Eyes alliance is fracturing. Each of these moves isn't independent. They're responses to the same calculation South Korea just made. China is here, America is there, and geography matters more than ideology. The transition has already happened. The world just hasn't fully processed it yet. South Korea made that transition undeniable by showing that even the most loyal U.S. ally will choose economic survival over military alignment when forced. The great irony is that the United States spent 30 years after the Cold War telling countries that economic integration creates peace and prosperity. South Korea took that advice and integrated with China. Now Washington is angry that the advice worked. This is the world now, not 5 years from now, now. And your ability to navigate what comes next depends entirely on seeing clearly that alliances without economic foundations are temporary, and that countries ultimately optimize for prosperity, not principle. South Korea understood that. Washington didn't. And this week, that understanding became policy.